There we are.
We're good.
So week 5.
Yes.
And still, I think, well into, was it chapter 4 or chapter 5? The very long chapter.
The very long chapter 5, I believe.
Yeah. And so we are cruising along. We started with encyclopedic, and had a couple of sections.
Finished
really just 3 sections.
Yeah,
I think,
finished
right?
with research.
Yeah. Which
Read research.
I should. There's fair warning. I don't have a lot to say about research, and what little I have to say is not extraordinarily positive. So I may have to ask you to make a case.
Okay.
If that's something that you're willing to do for that, but yeah. So I'll start with this, and then I'll be quiet for a minute and see what you have to say. But I was much more excited about reading this book last time.
Yeah.
I thought that the reading we had last meeting made a lot of things work for me. Sort of felt like they sort of made a sort of rewarded the investment I'd made in the book somewhat. And now I feel like we've sort of gone back to that kind of drudge, that kind of like plodding, sort of detail for detail's sake in today's section. And honestly, and maybe I don't know, maybe this is the essay I would write in the seminar if I were so constrained. But honestly, I thought that it was complaining about Settembrini's didactic sort of approach.
Sure.
At the same time that it was doing an even worse version. I mean, it just seemed like this excuse to talk about philosophy and biology and art in these ways that just didn't actually seem to fit the novel to me. So that's my opening serve, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a big Settembrini chunk, and all of chapter 5 I think is kind of Settembrini'd up. I would add that even though Hans has been annoyed with Settembrini's didacticism and his speechifying, and in his dreams he's like pushing him off window ledges and stuff, when he gets excited in Dr. Barron's office, he starts plagiarizing Settembrini left and right, like he's using direct language. I mean, I'll give you an example. Like over on page 273, he says, "No, it doesn't trouble me." This is the bottom of 273. "One can take it perfectly seriously, solemnly in fact. Only then is it rather out of place on a coffee machine. The ancients are said to have used such motifs on their sarcophagi. The sacred and the obscene were more or less the same thing to them." And that's directly, like Settembrini a long time ago, like maybe from week 3. I found the page on page 208.
Yeah.
Where Settembrini says this. I mean, I had to look for a long time to find that. I was like, I know he's copying. And his whole big speech about humanism,
right,
to Joaquin and Barron's, where they're kind of embarrassed at his, he's just like parroting the stuff he's heard. And I don't know if this is Mann's way of talking about how, intellectual ideas infect young people, and then young people, when they're excited, and maybe perhaps especially when they're in love, they're just grasping for meaning, and he's just like saying these words without fully understanding what they mean. Or if Mann is suggesting that Hans has somehow come to understand that Settembrini has a point, and he's trying to like advocate this kind of humanism, and I couldn't understand which it was, but I did think it was weird to see the same argument recapitulated again. I was like, Jesus, I've already seen all this speech, and it feels to me like it's making Hans look diminished, like he just seems like that know-it-all kid that's just saying something he heard somebody else say.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so.
So I didn't love that, I'll add.
Well, and I keep thinking about something we talked about last time, about how, and I want to say, I mean this in some ways to be kind of in defense of Hans, but he's in this kind of unique moment, right? This sort of first love, and it means that he's behaving oddly. So I think it's possible that this is sort of about him sort of trying to find a keel in this weirdness
Yeah.
of his experience. And I will say, today's reading began, I thought, sort of interestingly, and I'm circling around here, but with that kind of description of the kind of adolescent nature of the relationships up here as opposed to down there.
Right, the way it all revolves around hookups.
Right, and the kind of gossipy
Yes.
kind of like everybody. This probably deserves more attention at some point later, but I really like the kind of image of the patients kind of gathered in, chatting about who's connected to whom
Right.
at this particular moment. This
Right.
very kind of Mean Girls feeling, kind of seventh grade.
And they're trading
way.
out.
Right.
And they're,
Right.
yes,
Right.
it reminded me a lot of high school.
And it kind of culminates with Settembrini's kind of impassioned warning to Hans, to get out of here.
Right.
This is not right for you.
Yeah.
Go do real meaningful things.
Yeah.
All of this is just fluff. And I find myself pretty moved by aspects of what that seems to be doing. But then, as you say, later on it just seems like he's kind of fading into the background of this thing. And now we're back. Remember when we were all, weeks ago, when we were all, concerned that we were over-reading this because of Cuckoo's Nest, and now
Yeah.
we're now starting to feel like Cuckoo's Nest to me again,
Right,
a
right.
little bit. Different mechanism, right?
Yeah.
There's no mean nurse keeping you there.
Right.
Settembrini uses the Odysseus thing with Circe.
Yeah, you're going to be
that-
turned into swine.
Yeah, he's like you're already beginning to use your front appendages. A little.
Yeah.
And so
Well, and
there's-
he indicts himself. He's like, I wanted to go to this conference, but
Right.
but I've been cowed. I'm afraid I'm going to die. It's almost like he's saying, don't let the Hofrat get to you like he's gotten to me.
He also makes this argument, and I think this is maybe our way back to the scene in the other doctor's, the painter, in his rooms. wherever those are.
Right.
But it almost seems like Settembrini is giving himself an out in that same scene where he says, "Look, I can do work in my head.
Right.
You can't build boats in your head.
Right.
You can't be an engineer up here.
Right.
But I can be an academic up here."
Yeah.
And it's a convenient argument. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a
Right.
convenient argument that he gets to sort of like have it both ways.
Right.
Although I will point out,
One also wonders, let me just add to that, how much writing he's really getting done.
well, he offers the proof, right? He
Right.
pulls out of that apparently gigantic pocket in his coat.
That's true.
This
That's
whole
true.
thing. I was so taken with this, right? This is on 254.
Yeah.
He has been asked to, and I think this has happened to both of us at various points in our career. Some colleague or former grad student friend or somebody has reached out and said, hey, will you contribute to a thing?
Right.
Right. And sometimes it's really exciting, and sometimes it's more like, well, like, I guess I should, or I
Right.
guess I will. But he gets asked to contribute to this 20-volume study commissioned by the International League for the Organization of Progress, which, by
Right.
the way, like I hope that at some point this shows up in one of those Minions movies,
Right.
as the other entity or something. I just it's very kind of like satirical feeling to me. I don't know.
Absolutely.
I don't know how this feels in the early 1900s.
I think it's also influenced, again, I can't help but feel that Melville's Confidence Man has influenced this book, because this is exactly the kind of bullshit that characters on the boat talk. Like, we're going to end all human suffering, and they have organizations with names like this: the League,
Yeah.
the World's Charity,
Yeah.
passing around a hat all around the world,
Right.
kind of
Well,
stuff.
and I think historically speaking, this is that moment.
Yeah.
There was this weird moment, and I know, as a couple of science fiction geeks, both of us I feel confident that both of us are currently or about to start thinking about Firefly,
Yeah.
which has that sort of great indictment on
Yeah.
the better world
Right.
concept. But so here's this kind of this ridiculous thing. I mean, well intentioned, coming from a good soul, But this ridiculous thing, this 20-volume
Right.
work that's going to lay out this philosophy, which they say this is right at the bottom of 254. It deduces from Darwinian theory. You could almost stop there.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
you had me at.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
It deduces from Darwinian theory the philosophic concept that man's profoundest natural impulse is in the direction of self-realization. And I'm startled at how much I have been talking with people outside of the academy lately about this kind of, very 19th century positivism. This is on the rise.
Yeah.
Like maybe,
Oh, yeah.
Like maybe this is
Marianne Williamson, Jordan Peterson,
a little bit.
For both on the left and the right, there is the rise of this like sort of new age, what we refer to as new age.
Yeah.
Thinking, I think about Marianne Williamson saying at the Democratic primary debate, we don't have a health care problem, we have a health problem. Everybody needs to, do better with their diet and their exercise and all this bullshit. And
Right.
I'm sorry, that's what it sounds like when you're trying to put it into action.
Yeah.
I agree with you that stuff is on the rise on both the left and the right.
Yeah, well, and just this faith. I recently was visiting family and was kind of startled to hear one of my family members just kind of blithely like propose a theory of history, which is that things are always getting better.
Right.
And it's just kind of like, wow. I really kind of like was flummoxed.
Right.
And you don't want to be that guy all the time, but I was just kind of like, I don't think it. There's this profound optimism on the one hand, but there's also something else that is. I hate to sound like a jerk, but this kind of laziness, or this kind of like, I don't need to do anything.
Right.
It's just gonna do it on its own.
Right.
You probably have this experience too, having to remind people from time to time that evolution is not always sort of like better.
Right.
Like evolution means that a bunch of things don't work and things die.
Right.
And the one thing that lives gets to be a bunch of itself.
Right.
And so, it's not like there's some Matrix style architect going, opposable thumbs, yes,
Yeah.
It's like, no, there was a bunch of failures first.
Right.
So this idea that, Settembrini is gonna, they're gonna lay out this thing on the next page. A comprehensive and scientifically executed program has been drawn up, embracing all the projects for human improvement conceivable at the moment.
Yeah.
And there's this, I guess, arrogance is what
Absolutely.
I'm trying to get at. There's this optimism, but there's also just this arrogance of like, we're exactly what we need to be. We just have to get all the way on track.
The resolution of the class conflict
Yeah.
by means of all the social ameliorations which recommend themselves, and finally doing away with national conflicts, the abolition of war through the development of international law. And it's so over the top that Mon is obviously mocking this
right?
utopian style
Well,
thinking.
and if that wasn't enough, right? Two pages later, he's still talking about this.
Right.
He lays out his project, right?
Yeah.
Because Hans is like, but what are you doing?
Right.
This is science, and you're not a scientist.
Yeah.
And he says, aha, right at the end of 256. This great work will not neglect the letterist, which is what I'm going to put on my business cards the next time I order
Yes.
cards. Professor of English, bell letterist.
Yes.
Insofar as he deals with human suffering, a whole volume.
Right.
A volume is projected which shall contain a compilation and brief analysis of such masterpieces of the world's literature as come into question by depicting one or other kind of conflict for the consolation and instruction of the suffering. This, then, is the task entrusted to your humble servant in the letter you see here. So, in a way, what strikes me about this is how familiar it is.
Yeah.
How many CFPs have you seen over the years that kind of hint at leaning in this direction? Both in terms of this super ambitious,
like a comprehensive case for environmental justice.
right? Or a 30-volume study of,
Right.
These kinds of things. At the same time that it's really stuck in this. With the benefit of hindsight, obviously, stuck in this dangerous ideology I mean, I mean, this is the same language of those early 20th century eugenicists.
It's the language that's coming in Germany
Right.
that Thomas Mann sees coming,
Right.
right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
both the rise of authoritarianism that led to World War One, but then certainly World War Two, which comes later, where Mann, I guess, has to flee anyway,
Right.
is based on some version of perfecting the world, right?
Well-
I mean, fascism, you know,
Yeah.
is linguistically a
Right.
promise
Right.
that if we just do these things, all will be perfected,
Right.
Right.
And I just think in the broader context that we're seeing this happen in this world that Settembrini is dismissing as fluff and
Right.
not significant, he's also building a place for himself. And I feel like for a long time he has been the sort of moral conscience of the book
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
But now I just feel like the bottom is falling out, because suddenly he's like, "You gotta go." Oh, but now I can do my thing
Right.
anywhere, and there's this like cake and eat it too, which honestly is, I mean, fully on script for this kind of like creative class, upper class
Sure.
person.
What are now referred to as elitists.
Right, coastal,
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
which I am,
Right.
I guess I should say, and so I feel like there's this kind of flip right in the middle of this week's reading, where this guy who I kind of rolled my eyes at, but he was like that old guy who was basically right. Like he didn't use all the terms of art today, but he was basically right. And I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
like I get it, but we don't always have to talk about it. But I get it.
Right.
To being this guy who's a little more teetery feeling, and I think coming back to what made me kind of start on this, the way that Hans just apes his stuff about the pharaohs later on.
And about humanism in general.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and then reframing that, where I really felt myself digging in is that scene where they're looking at the painting.
Absolutely. That was the best part of today's read.
and-
Isn't it ironic? Maybe it's not ironic. Isn't it interesting that our favorite scene last time was in the Hofrat's science
Yeah.
room?
Right.
And our favorite scene this time is in the Hofrat's art gallery.
I hadn't thought about that.
And so...
And they're both very visual.
Yeah.
Huh.
And I mean, it may be that what we're saying is that Behrens is the most compelling character secretly, that it's not Settembrini, it's not Hans, it's not even Claudia, that the Hofrat scenes are where so far Mann is maybe bringing the most heat. But it was, in a way, when you've got Settembrini and Hans now trying to argue that all is united, engineering, science, medicine, art, literature, and Hans trying to ape that language, it's interesting that the Hofrat is both. He's doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's a medical scientist and he's painting.
Right. And Hans was such a twerp.
Right.
Kind of all throughout, right?
Right.
I mean, so they start off talking about the cigars.
Right. Which I liked, by the way.
Well, I was going to say, as a former smoker, I felt a real kind of warmth.
Yeah, they get out their
there.
cases, they trade cigars,
Yeah. Where's it? 264, 263.
Yeah, 263 all the way through 265, really.
Yeah, right at the end of 263. How's your cabbage leaf, Costa?
Yeah.
Let me see. I'm a connoisseur. That's a good ash. And I'm reminded of these kind of moments.
Sure.
I mean, don't get me wrong, right? Like the most profound memory I have of a smoker, and I stop me if I've told you this before, but the most profound memory I have is working in a restaurant, just having one of those apocalyptic days. I had done a breakfast shift at one place. This while I was in school. I did a breakfast shift at one place and then got called in for an evening shift at the other place where I worked. And so, going like 7 to 10, 7 to 11, something like that. And then thinking I was done for the day and then getting called in again at like 3.
Yeah.
Which I know like, poor soft-handed me, right?
Right.
Like, meanwhile, plenty of people are pulling 12 hours.
Sure.
But
It's real easy to end up doing a 12-hour day when you work in the restaurant
Yeah,
business,
well,
so
I
it's
just
not
thought-
really that soft.
Well, but I thought my day was over,
Right.
And then it wasn't, and
Right.
then it was a bad shift on top of that.
Right.
And I remember just, I was just talking about this with somebody the other day, that like the one like sacrament in the restaurant is a cigarette.
Yeah.
Like nobody, like Bill Gates could come down from Microsoft and find you smoking behind the restaurant, and even he couldn't make you. He could make you hurry,
Yeah.
but he couldn't make you not finish that cigarette. Like that
That's
was the
right.
rule.
That's
and
right.
I don't know who made it. I
Right.
never saw it written down, but I understood implicitly
It's sacrosanct.
that the boss could come out like red faced, ready to be mad, and all you had to do is go, and he'd be like, well, okay, but when you're done.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And so the profoundest memory I have about being a smoker is that night at the restaurant, 8 or 9 o'clock, in the middle of this apocalyptic shift, just going out back and smoking a cigarette in like 2 drags.
Yeah.
I mean, just
Powering it down. Yeah.
and just thinking like I've got to figure something out. And
Right.
I think it was like about that foretop,
Yeah.
about my school, about my life. I mean,
Right.
everything distilled to this one moment.
Something needs to change.
Which is not about the pleasure. This is
Right.
not about the Marlboro commercial.
No.
But I also have these memories of like sitting around with dudes, and not just dudes, but just sitting around with other people and being like, huh. Like when I started smoking, it was Marlboros and Camels.
Yeah.
If there's an old guy there, like a Vietnam era guy, Lucky's.
Lucky's or Pall Malls.
Yeah. And then
Then you had your quirky Winston smokers.
every once in a while, although that was a racial thing for me, only black people smoked Winstons and
Menthols.
and Newports.
Newports,
Where-
which I went through a Newport phase in college, actually.
I was not opposed to a menthol,
Yeah.
but it wasn't my steady diet. But you'd have these moments. Just before I quit, what was it was a blue package, Parliament. Parliament became kind of the thing.
Yeah.
Just before I quit smoking, and I remember like, hey, what's and like trading like 2 cigarettes with somebody.
And then people that smoked American Spirits did keep them in a case.
There was always
like
always
this.
that dude, and I hated that guy. Let
Yeah.
me just go on record.
Yeah.
I always hated that guy who was like, yeah, mine has no additives. I'm like,
Right.
yeah, that's what's getting me. That's where all the bad stuff is.
Yeah.
But so this is a likable moment.
Yeah,
But,
absolutely it is.
The head, one of the head guys comes out. They're trading conversation about cigars. They're like, and they're like legit serious.
They are, and I didn't even mind. I mean, I know Joaquin was a little pissed off, and it was maybe a little low. But Hans is right that Joaquin's trying to keep him to himself. Joaquin's pressuring Hans. Hans wants to socialize. He wants to be around Claudia. Joaquin's being kind of a dick, I'll just say. And so I wasn't, all that upset when he manipulated Joaquin into going to the Hofrat's house to see the painting using some underhanded rhetoric. Like, obviously he just wants to see the painting of Claudia.
It's desperate, yeah.
And Joaquin feels like he got tricked into this, but that didn't bother me. And I rather enjoyed the conversation between them at the end.
Yeah.
When Hans says... what is it? He says something like, I don't know if I'm able to find it. He's like, that was a good idea, admit it, he says to Joaquin. And Joaquin's like, fine, it wasn't that bad or whatever. So they had a good time. This is it. Page 279. As they went along the corridors, Hans Kastrup said to his cousin, confessed that it was a good idea of mine. It was a change at least. So even though Hans kind of made an ass of himself, he got what he wanted. He got to hold the painting and look at the painting. And if the Hofrat's not an idiot, I think Hans has also given himself away that he's crazy about this girl.
Right.
Yeah. But that was, to me, the most compelling part of the reading, just the way that he was so desperate to be near the painting, even though Mon is off to the side being like, man, this painting doesn't look anything like her. Right. It does not matter. What matters is that she in the flesh sat for this painting.
Well, I tell you what stands out to me about that is I love that Barron's seems to know what his deal is. He's like, I'm not very good.
Right.
Yeah, I like to do it, but I'm not
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
And I think that stands in stark contrast to Settembrini, who's like weaving these incredibly complex theories of unified everything
Yeah.
at the same time that he's giving himself these outs for why he's doing it this way or
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
And it seems like one of the things that this particular, and I know that the way that we're breaking up the reading is somewhat arbitrary.
Yeah.
But within this unit, it feels like that kind of stands as a kind of foil, these two things to each other, where we have this guy who I think is supposed to be ambiguously maybe not so good, right? I mean, we were comparing him to Frankenstein
Right.
earlier,
Right.
and there's all this gossip about him being a philanderer and this kind of thing.
But
here's
there's
this
also
guy-
the devastating loss of his wife, and other ways in which I think we're meant to
right.
not be sure about him
And
yet.
he knows what's what.
He does.
I like this down to earthness of a guy who's like, there's something about being kind of like unapologetically like interested in something, like the cigars, that in a way it's like I talk about this a lot with my students, and I'm not sure if it's just me or if it actually makes sense, but like there's this problem with being cool,
Yeah.
which is that you dismiss the value of certain things.
Yeah.
And the Hofrat's not doing that. The Hofrat's like, oh, cigars are really, I mean, it's a serious, like, I'm into it. Like, let's go.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, he's able to be, I think, cool about this painting where he's like, oh, yeah, I try, but whew, I'm not very good at it.
Right. Right.
And it makes him really credible and really likable,
Yeah.
I find. But then what's up? I mean, just a genuine question. What is going on with Hans that he just keeps asking these kind of increasingly abstract and ridiculous questions? Tell me more about skin. Is he just buying time?
And then, well, I think he's buying time. It also leads into the research chapter to come. I think that maybe, and this could be a reach, but maybe Hans took Settembrini's message to heart that the only way you get to stay up here is if you learn to be an intellectual. And so now he's going to try to buy himself more time to be in Claudio's proximity by doing the same work that Settembrini is doing, being a thinker, being an intellectual, learning about stuff, right, and trying to figure out where it all connects. And that may be part of why he's aping Settembrini's rhetoric anyway. Certainly that research chapter, I think we are supposed to believe that in earnest, it's like, no, really, he's really reading about embryology and about astronomy and biology and physiognomy, and he wants to. All of it is metaphorical for the sex urge, right? And there, he starts talking about sperm and eggs and everything else, and then at one point it crystallizes into an image of Claudia leaning over him and poising her foot upon the toe.
Sort of right
and,
at the end, yeah.
Well, at the end, I would suggest that he might be masturbating at the end. And we'll talk about that. Let's talk about it now.
Yeah.
I mean, here he's like, page 299, the books lay piled on the table, one lay on the matting next to his chair. His head rested upon Hans Kor's stomach and oppressed his breath, yet no order went from the cortex to the muscles in charge to take it away. He had read down the page. His chin sunk upon his chest, and over his innocent blue eyes the lids had fallen. He beheld the image of life in flower, its structure, its flesh-born loveliness. She had lifted her hands from behind her head. She opened her arms. On their inner side, particularly beneath the tender skin of the elbow points, he saw the blue branchings of the larger veins. These arms were of unspeakable. He's fantasizing. She leaned above him. She inclined onto him and bent down over him. He was conscious of her organic fragrance and the mild pulsation of her heart. Something warm and tender clasped him round the neck, which I had to read as somewhat euphemistic. Melted with desire and awe, there's the word melted, he laid his hands upon the flesh of her upper arms where the fine-grained skin over the triceps came to scent so heavenly cool, and upon his lips he felt the moist clinging of her kiss. So he's either masturbating or he's thinking about it, I think, as he falls asleep from all this reading these biology books, and I just found it to be so weird and surreal. I rather liked the chapter, even if maybe part of it was Thomas Mann showing off like how well read he is.
Yeah, I found the very end here sort of interesting enough, but I've got to say it felt not worth the investment of getting through the kind of catalog of stuff that moved us.
I know, but it's just interesting, the idea that Claudia herself is the image of life. Like he's that into her now on page 288.
Yeah.
The image of life displayed itself to Hans Kostorp. It hovered, so here's this hovering again.
Yeah.
And then on the next page you get what I thought was a pretty great line. That is the image of life. Its lips, it looked down at him beneath drooping eyes, out of eyes made to appear slanting. Its lips were half open, even a little curled. It rested its weight on one leg. The hip bones stood out sharply. So now it's just like crystallizing. All the stuff he's been reading is taking her form. While the other relaxed, nestled its slightly bent knee against the inside of the supporting leg and poised the foot only upon the toes. And it's just interesting to me how he's so smitten with her now that she's the very principle of life.
Yeah. Well, and this was where he was headed in this conversation with the Hofrat,
right,
during the painting.
Right.
He's asking all these kind of specifically biological questions that are also, I would argue, maybe kind of like alchemical or philosophical, something, that seem basically. I don't know if I'm oversimplifying this in part because I was a little frustrated with this section,
right?
But I kind of felt like he was essentially just like asking this kind of child's question, like what is it?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Like what
Yeah.
is all this?
Yeah.
And he's like, talking about lymph nodes and skin and fat cells and
blood. Yeah.
And he kept kind of circling back. He's like, I'm deeply interested in this, but
right.
And on the one hand, it felt like he was stalling. I almost thought he was making fun of him for a minute.
Right.
In that way that people will, like, oh, do tell me,
Right.
This is fascinating. Say some
Yeah.
more about this. But then later, it kind of felt like maybe like he had some weird sort of recognition that there was this thing he just had never even thought about before, which is that there's some, and maybe this circles back to the Frankenstein thing earlier, but that there's some like essential something,
Yeah.
right? And he doesn't know what it is,
Right.
And Claudia's it, I
Yes.
suppose, in his memory,
Yes.
or his imagination, and I'm going to maintain my position that it was a long way getting there, but
very long.
But this is kind of an interesting development in terms of this guy is now philosophizing, like this first love led to this kind of philosophizing, and I don't know. I mean, is that kind of a cliche, or is that just a fair is that a fair depiction of what this is?
I mean, a lot of people, when they teach Romeo and Juliet or analyze it, they like to talk about how ridiculous Romeo sounds, right? Like that in this way that like love just makes you think that you talked about this 2 or 3 readings ago, that you're the first person this has ever happened to, and so now everybody should want to hear you talk all about it at length, and that it leads you to feel like you know more about other stuff too. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think it's definitely a cliche that, I'm thinking about the movie Elf now, and Will Ferrell bursting into the room. I'm in love, and I don't care who knows it.
Right.
I think there is a cliche to this that
Yeah.
Mann is playing with.
Yeah, but what a strange reaction to all of this. I mean,
Yeah.
to do what seems like essentially a graduate seminar in kind of like Enlightenment era science and philosophy, because you have feelings,
Right.
and I have to say, like, that was not my reaction.
No, not mine either. And I mean, I guess metaphorically you could say it's he's been awakened to a whole other side of life, and he doesn't want to stop with just being attracted to her. He wants to understand more things now that this new thing.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not cliche. Maybe that's like just something real going on with the character. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just trying to understand why is he reading all this
I
stuff.
hadn't thought about that. I think I'm overemphasizing the love, and in the process maybe forgetting just how different. Like this was a guy with a plan.
Yeah.
He always had a plan.
Right.
And now he's in this kind of indeterminate sort of schedule of like, we'll get there when we get there.
The only thing that you can count on is the time of the meals.
Right. And getting exposed to all of these sort of different people. Oh, this reminds me, I want to circle back to something else connected to this. But, that he's just suddenly in a very different world.
Yeah.
And I guess that rattles you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that just kind of recognizing that there is this, people actually make this work, this thing that you never even considered. And maybe that's part of it. I don't know. But what do you make of, and I have some theories, but I don't know, the strange emphasis, and I'm just sort of realizing with this today's reading that it's not the first time that we've seen the pattern of this a little bit, but this kind of emphasis on the kind of like what Settembrini calls the Asiatic or the Oriental
Right.
over the European, that to live up on the mountain is to be Asian, right? Which is why all those Russians are there.
Yeah.
And he desperately wants Hans to go back to the flatland and be European.
Right.
By which I understand him to mean essentially like abide by these continental values and in particular
Enlightenment, maybe?
well, and in particular the Enlightenment ideas that had to do with like that were maybe connected to Protestantism, in the kind of thing that we would maybe now think of as prosperity gospel, as opposed to
that's nice.
this other thing.
Yeah, yeah. But something that's more mystified and perhaps even goes back to your point that we see what I call the New Age rhetoric on the rise. Settembrini maybe is thinking of that as sort of Asian gobbledygook.
Well, he certainly wouldn't be the first one to
He
put
wouldn't.
those two together.
He would not. I mean, this idea of mysticism, even like, Kill Bill and stuff like that always plays into this. Kung Fu Panda, you name it.
Right.
We're
I just saw that
yeah.
just now, just like last week.
Yeah.
And what an outstanding! I mean, for
Yeah.
as far as Big Dumb Fun
Yeah.
goes, what an
It's
outstanding.
that scene
But-
where they're fighting over the frickin' where he's training and they're fighting over the dumpling.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like, if I animated that, I would be like, I just did something great.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But it plays into those stereotypes too, and
Right.
this idea of like, it's not Enlightenment thinking. It's something else. It's it I guess at its heart believes that rationalism is its own kind of trap. That the Industrial Revolution wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and that reason and logic can only get you so far in life, and you gotta learn to work on yourself in these other kinds of ways. And Settembrini does not. He thinks that what that leads to is, I guess, what you called fluffery.
Yeah. I mean, I think so.
I would suggest, though, as a counterpoint, as somebody who often critiques Jefferson and the Enlightenment, that I think by contrast, a lot of the problems Settembrini seems to hate were exacerbated by the Enlightenment.
Right.
Certainly, different levels of warfare, certainly different levels of class stratification. I mean, like this goes back to your family member saying everything's just getting better and better. No doubt I don't want to go live in feudal Spain in the 12th century. Don't get me wrong. It's just that there's a but to that.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm a big fan of the grind.
Yeah.
I run for hours at a time for fun.
Right.
And on some level, I think am really well equipped to kind of like feel what he's saying in that scene when he's sort of warning. I mean, it's the lotus eater, lotus eaters in a way there, but there's this kind of there's this interesting thing, and I think it has to do, and I honestly don't know. This may actually be the first bit of like real research I start to do coming up here. Is I honestly don't know where Mon fits into this conversation about, I guess what I would think of as kind of like Enlightenment to kind of postmodernism, because I feel like there's a lot of things that I'm a big fan of when it comes to the Enlightenment. I really like this idea of logic.
Yeah.
I like, the sort of like, proof is the thing you can know and not the thing you can't say isn't true. I can't remember if I ever told you, but I was once proselytized to by a neighbor shortly after moving here, a person with an advanced degree, who really desperately needed me to be a believer, and was trying to be polite and not really come on too strong, but I was just kind of like, not really, sorry. And the response was, I've thought about it, and nobody has ever come up with anything that made me think it wasn't true.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, but that's different from coming up with something to make you think it's true.
Yes.
Yes. And so big fan of that. Big fan of like logic and reason and all that. But it's always been interesting to me that comes handcuffed to this idea of the grind.
Yeah.
That is so essential to the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
That with logic comes this just kind of like work ethic.
Yeah.
And I think part of what we're seeing,
And Protestantism, let's be honest.
Well,
like the very religious sensibilities that you're...
Yeah, you didn't need to read the Bible.
Yeah.
Until it mattered that you thought about things.
Right,
You
right,
know?
right.
I mean, until you had to apply reason,
Yeah.
It was fine to just be like, I'm all in, whatever
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, but the two are not necessarily connected, right? I mean, it's not, they don't, you can be logical and lazy at the same time.
Absolutely, you can be.
And so, I approve of the grind in whatever kind of, abstract way. But I also think that what one of the things that has done is create this fiction. Now, I'm drifting off a little bit here, but I think it's created a fiction that, the successes that were really the result of things like, theft of workers' time and straight up slavery and things like that,
Yeah.
Were explained away as the grind, right?
That's right.
That Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and all those guys were great because they worked hard.
That's right.
Was this fiction, that explained these things that were really just about, being born in a particular position or having certain privileges or opportunities that were
Right.
just simply not there for other people. And so I'm nervous about this idea that Settembrini is
Yeah.
promoting, but I think he's not wrong at the same time to say this is like very, very much the continent in this moment.
Yeah. And to be fair to him, he is trying to fix problems on the continent. So he's not saying the continent is perfect. He's saying, in fact, his idea that they're going to eliminate class conflict entirely suggests that he himself is a little skeptical of the grind as a sanctified idea.
Right.
So he doesn't have a completely unified, well, nobody who talks as much as he does, ourselves included, has a unified theory of life, the universe, and everything, even though I know that the encyclopedia is supposed to feature that.
Right. But I think it's really interesting, right, that he gives Hans this warning that you're going to get sucked into this.
Yeah.
Right? We had this thing where I went to college. We had this main courtyard, and then the dorms were built on little courtyards,
Mm-hmm.
but the main courtyard was sort of the only way out, and it was the site of most of the sort of social interaction that we had on campus. And we had these things we called vortexes, where like a couple people would be sitting, it had this low wall all the way around it, and people would sit on the wall and talk, and you'd walk by and say, hey, and start talking to them. And the next thing you knew, it was like 2 hours. And go by, and you're like, damn, I got caught in a vortex.
Yeah.
And it was like a thing.
Right.
And like professors would be like, for real, this is due on Friday. Don't get caught in a lot of vortexes between now and then.
Right.
And I feel like Settembrini is saying, like, this is a vortex. You're going to get caught in this, and it's going to be a real problem. But, I had to remember, he could do this Hans has income. He's rich.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't think of himself as rich, but he's rich.
He's rich, yeah.
He could just live here.
Yeah, we've already been told
Rest
this.
of his life.
Yeah.
And you know, maybe it's something to do with where I am, you know, with work and life. But part of me is like, all right then.
We talked about this before. I think this is one of the sub arguments, if not the argument of the book, is a version of "Wouldn't it be nice?" You know, a rejection. You know, much like Hemingway, I think. You know, talking in, I believe it's For Whom the Bell Tolls, talking about. No, it's either For Whom the Bell Tolls or Farewell to Arms, where he's talking about how, you know, all this language about honor and love and glory didn't mean anything to any of us anymore. Like, all we really cared about was like street addresses and when we were going to eat.
Right.
You know, and like Mon might be very well saying, you know, the world down there is so corrupt that the real dream is to get out of it. But of course, as you point out, not just Hans, everybody that's there has got to be some level of wealthy.
Right.
Like, to be able to be there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
So this is a bunch of rich people.
Yeah.
Even the bad Russian table.
Right.
They're rich too.
Yeah. Well, and so, you know, the book kind of squares that circle.
Yeah.
By saying Settembrini doesn't frame this work as like good in and of itself.
Right.
It's not that Protestant.
Right.
He suggests that what Hans needs to do is get out and go about the business of improving humanity.
Yeah.
And so for him, the grind is about being part of this positivism.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really tempting. I mean, you know, in our thing, that's what we'd call mission, right?
Right.
You know, why do teachers teach? You know,
Yeah.
no, they don't really do it for the money.
Right.
It's the mission.
It's the mission.
They're
It's the
improving-
calling.
They're improving humanity.
Yeah.
You know, they're doing what's right
Yeah.
because they care.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what that kind of, you know, Settembrini's trying to obligate Hans to this mission, to this world. But in a way, it's a tough sell, and not just because I don't believe necessarily in the mission, but also because, you know, and Settembrini's got to understand this on some level. Like, here's a young man feeling love for the first time, like chasing a girl for the first time
Right.
in his life. And Settembrini's like, you better get out there and start building ships.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
No, yeah, right. Not gonna happen.
I mean,
Not gonna happen.
You know, I mean, that is like Friday at 4:30. The boss calls you and says he's got a project. You know,
Yes.
kind of thing. And,
Yeah.
and I'm intrigued at how, you know, for a guy who keeps saying he's a humanist, how little he seems to understand what Hans.
And this has always been the knock against, for example, Marxists. You know, Marxist theory included, is that it rejects the sort of human impulses of things like love and sexual attraction and familial obligation and a lot of those other things, right? This is one of the reasons that Marxism comes into such conflict with, in our field, with people who take a more psychoanalytical approach to literature, people who take a more gender studies approach to literature. Such hostility from pure Marxist
Right.
thinking, because it's like, no, you have to be fully devoted to the cause. Right. And for 24-year-old Hans, like you said, it's going to be a big no sell on that. Mm-hmm. Like, he likes this girl, and that's going to be what he's doing now. Yeah. And on some level, that's, you can complain about it, but nature tells us that's how it should be, because either that or we're badly wired, because it's how we always do it, you know.
Yeah, I mean, what is his obligation here? Is I guess the question that I would ask. You know, he has gone to some trouble to be educated to enough that this firm wants him as a shipbuilding engineer. Although, am I remembering right that it was like an unpaid internship? Basically?
No, he was going to get paid. I think that he had. Maybe we need to revisit that. I think the implication was that a real job was waiting for him, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'll have to go back. It's in that section when he's explaining to Joachim how it's not going to be a problem for him to stay. And I
Right.
thought there was something about how it was an apprenticeship or something.
Okay.
But I'll
Let's look that up for next
yeah,
time.
I'll look it up. I'll put it in my notes here. But he did go to some trouble, to get educated.
Right.
Which, I mean, I was going to say back then, but hell, even today, is no mean feat. I mean,
Right.
he completed his coursework and he took his math classes and
Yeah.
and he snuck in music appreciation or whatever.
Yeah.
And he didn't piss off the English teacher.
Right.
And he got through.
Yeah.
And I want to say on some point, on some level, that creates an obligation. Like, and now what?
Yeah.
I was hanging out with an old friend recently, as you know, and along with being roommates, we both worked at the same restaurant for a while, and I hadn't realized that she walked out. The owner yelled at her in front of a customer at one point,
Yeah.
and she was like a month from leaving anyway, and was just like, yo,
Yeah.
and just did that thing, that we
Yeah.
all fantasize
Yeah.
about. But we were talking about restaurant work, and she told me this weird thing. This is a dinky. Actually, if you're going to be there, you should scout it out and see if that place is still there. If you're going to be there next week, but the there's a little highway, Italian place. She told me that she still kind of measures all food against this place.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Where was I going? I totally lost my train of thought. Okay, so I was thinking when I was talking to her about this, I was thinking that oddly enough, I've been having these strange, completely impractical fantasies about not teaching anymore,
Right.
and going back to restaurant work.
Yeah.
Like that's a thing.
Right.
Right. But I know what people would think, and what I ultimately would probably catch myself asking is, it's like, for real? 100 years of college, and you're just going to go back and work in restaurants?
Yeah.
So there is this obligation
Right.
that you put yourself in somehow.
Yeah.
And I don't know the full nature of that.
Yeah.
There's also this kind of, I think, philosophical, I think, I think like a pragmatist, or one of these continental guys might say some version of you just owe humanity some goodness.
That seems to be, yeah.
There's this kind of philosophical sweat equity of some sort.
Yeah.
And all that granted. At the same time, what does he really owe anybody? I
Right.
mean, he's an orphan. He's got no family that really is relying on him. Nobody really seems to need him.
Didn't seem to bother anybody that he's staying up here.
Right? I mean, and so on the other hand, what is the real nature of his obligation to the world, and would it be such a loss? I mean, would it be this tragedy if he just kind of lived out his life in this place?
I think that's a central question the book is asking, and not just of him, but by extension of any of us.
Right.
What would it mean to check out? Now, of course, many of us do develop these obligations. You think about Thoreau talking about, what it means to just sort of live differently. And, he acknowledges somewhere in one of his essays, it might be Walden, he acknowledges, well, if you have kids or family members counting on you, then that's hard. And, he's gracious enough
Right.
to admit that. But, it may very well be asking all of us to sort of think about the book, that is, this book, to think about our own selves and what it would mean to check out. How would it affect the world if we checked out? Just as a general thing to ask yourself, maybe as a useful intellectual exercise.
Yeah. Well, it seems so unthinkable.
Right.
Right. And I suspect it's because, you and I, while I'm sure there were some differences, we were raised in the same basic ideology of work hard,
Be a striver.
succeed,
Yeah.
all that kind of thing. And it is, I mean, it's interesting to me that, for instance, when I advise students, I mean, one of the major themes every time I talk to a student is, don't work so hard. Give yourself time to do good work.
Right.
You don't do 17 hours.
Right.
And even if you can get it done, Like, who cares?
Right.
I'm constantly telling students, take 5 years. Never in any, like, I challenge anybody to find me that person who at 70 was like, oh, if I'd only finished my bachelor's in 4 years instead
Right.
of 5.
Right.
Right.
That's right.
Like, slow down, like, have a little fun.
Yeah.
Do the thing, but maybe like go to parties every once in a while,
Right.
and get 8 hours of sleep.
Yeah.
And even in the midst of all that, when I really stop and consider what Hans could do here, I actually find that I'm my first reaction is this kind of existential horror. And it's just, I don't think that's the right reaction, but there it is.
Yeah.
I'm like, you can't just not do anything.
Right. Right.
When clearly, like, lots of people do.
Right.
In some fashion or another.
Yeah.
I mean, so I don't know. I don't know what you do with that. But you're right. I think that is taking shape. Maybe this is part of the problem that I'm having with the path that gets us to the end of today's reading, is that that's what this looks like, and I'm a little horrified by it, sort of even against my own judgment.
Yeah, and I'll be curious to see where it goes.